Thanks for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Christina Evans. Again, we do want to continue to cover some of these top stories that we're going to be watching. Putting this up on your screen there from Reuters, as tomorrow is going to be a very big day for the Supreme Court. They're going to be weighing whether or not President Trump's executive order seeking to end birthright citizenship is going to withstand constitutional and legal muster. Of course, this is a case that tests a key aspect of the president's second-term immigration agenda. This case, known as Trump versus Barbara, questions if President Trump's order that was issued back on his first day back in the White House is in violation of the 14th Amendment's Citizenship Clause and federal immigration law. So to talk a lot more about what we may hear from the court tomorrow, I'd like to bring in immigration attorney Susham Modi. Susham, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox.
Hi, thanks for having me back on, Christina. Good to see you.
Of course, there's so much to unpack, though, with a conversation like this. Very big day for the Supreme Court tomorrow. But there might be folks at home who have been talking or maybe even listening in to those conversations about birthright citizenship who aren't exactly clear on what that is and is tied to the 14th Amendment. Can you break that down for us first?
Sure. So the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, it was ratified in 1868. So to give us an idea of this, what it says is all persons born in the United States, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are U.S. citizens. And so the key element here is, what does it mean to be subject to the jurisdiction thereof? And that's the key point that the Supreme Court is going to look at. Now, historically speaking, just to take a step back, everyone born in the United States has been deemed to be a U.S. citizen, except for very, very limited or narrow exceptions. Think of like diplomats, for example, born here aren't U.S. citizens, or Native American Indians. But other than that, historically speaking, for over a century, over 125 years, it's generally been the rule that if you're born in the United States, you're a U.S. citizen, despite your parents' immigration status.
All right, we certainly appreciate you breaking that down, because that is the center of this entire discussion. And Susham, when it comes to tomorrow, the Supreme Court, they're going to be hearing these oral arguments. What's at the center of this when the court is being asked to decide? What's the specific legal question there?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. It's going to be that specific statement of how the Supreme Court interprets subject to this jurisdiction thereof. I mean, even if we just look at a common example of it, it doesn't talk about the plain language of the U.S. Constitution. It doesn't talk about anything related to the parents. So it doesn't say, subject to the parents being permanently living here. So if we look at like the plain language reading of it, which a lot of conservative justices do, it doesn't speak about the parents' domicile. And then, of course, there's the famous Ark case that you had posted earlier. And that's the seminal case. That's the crucial case that's interpreted that provision of the 14th Amendment.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that was a landmark case that happened back in the 1800s, if I'm not mistaken. So how is that going to tie in to some of the arguments that are likely to happen tomorrow?
That's exactly right. It was in 1898. To give us a historical example, because this is what the Supreme Court's looking at, it was the first major case to interpret the 14th Amendment, and it was only a merely 30 years after the 14th Amendment was ratified. So this is the way our jurisprudence works, is the Supreme Court's going to look at what were the framers' intent. And in that case, in the Ark case, what happened was it was not during a good time of U.S. history. It was during the Chinese Exclusion Act. So there's a lot of racial discrimination against Chinese nationals at the time. And in fact, that act didn't allow Chinese nationals to become U.S. citizens. In the Ark case, it was an individual that was born to two Chinese national parents. And it had gone up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court had said, no, that he was still a U.S. citizen, even though he was born to Chinese parents, and even with the Chinese Exclusion Act during that, again, not good time in U.S. history. And so that's the seminal case that's going to be looked at. Now, on the other side of the equation, the Trump administration is saying, well, his parents were domiciled, meaning they were like permanently living in the U.S. Now, the concept of permanent residents, like green card holders, Christina, that didn't exist in 1898. So this idea of like how much presence do the parents have to be in the United States wasn't even looked at much with the Ark case. It was really, we're looking at the children. Are the children, subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, I think, not what the parent status is, versus the Trump administration in their executive order is trying to say, okay, well, the parents, status should be looked at to determine if someone's a U.S. citizen. But that's never been ruled on before. And over a century, that's not how it's been applied when someone's born in the U.S.
That is interesting as you're breaking down the history versus what we're looking at now. And so, Susham, let's talk about the Supreme Court and its makeup as we're taking a live look there at the building. We do, of course, know that the justices on there at this point are leaning in a more conservative direction, many of them actually appointed by President Trump himself. And so when it comes to overlooking a case as old as this, law that is as old as this in our country, the precedent that has previously been set, when you're looking at the makeup of the Supreme Court, have you seen any willingness to challenge some of these laws that have been in place for such a long time here in our country?
I have not, Christina. And actually, it's interesting because if the Supreme Court justices are more conservative, as you mentioned, they actually lean towards like a conservative interpretation of the Constitution, like the plain language reading I was mentioning earlier. So again, the plain language of the Constitution doesn't talk anything about the parents. It doesn't even mention the parents in the 14th Amendment. And neither did the first case, the Ark case. So it's interesting that maybe that because they're conservative, more conservative Supreme Court, they may be looking at the original intent even more carefully. So it might have the opposite effect. It might actually rule that the executive order is unconstitutional.
It'll be interesting to see how all of this plays out. And so, Susham, I have to ask you, what are some of the realistic possible rulings that the court could ultimately bring down? Doesn't always have to be plain and straight. So what could we be seeing once that decision is made?
I think they are actually going to rule on the merits. So when I had been on your program earlier, they were just looking at whether it could be on hold or not, like an injunction versus a class action. This is actually going to go to the merits. Like, does the 14th Amendment state that, the Trump administration's executive order looking at the parents and U.S. birth is unconstitutional? So I do think the Supreme Court's going to have to make a ruling on the actual substance of individuals born in the United States. Personally, and as you know, I used to be a law professor. I think that this is going to be deemed unconstitutional, President Trump's executive order, that is. And so, and if it's not, if we had to take the other scenario, which I don't think is likely, I think the Supreme Court's going to determine that the executive order is unconstitutional. But in the scenario that the executive order is upheld, there's going to be a lot of things that we don't know how the outcome is going to be. So all those individuals that are born here in the United States, Christina, what is their status? They were born here. They've been raised here. They don't have citizenship or status in another country. So what happens to them? Do they become stateless? Now, new individuals that are born here, how are hospitals supposed to look into the parents' heritage and status? So it's going to create a bunch of other issues if it's deemed constitutional. Again, I don't think that's a scenario. I think it'll be deemed unconstitutional. And then the last thing I would say, Christina, is this could affect a lot of people. Some studies say about 250,000 individuals born in the United States per year.
I think that'll be interesting. And I like the way that you were able to talk about the number that's related to this case and why so many people are paying attention to what the Supreme Court ultimately will decide on this. And so lastly, before I let you go, Susham, I have to ask you, would this decision possibly open the door to challenges on other constitutional rights and interpretations? Is that a possibility?
I don't think so, Christina. And the reason why is just like we've been looking at this case, like historically, what was the original intent on the 14th Amendment, and then 30 years later with specifically the Ark case, the Supreme Court really wants to limit individual analysis on each case. Like, what is the intent on that specific rule? So I don't think this decision will have an impact on other areas like TPS or like the tariffs decision that already came out by the Supreme Court. So I think it'll be limited to this specific issue.
All right, so it'll certainly be interesting and something that we're going to watch and monitor here on Live Now from Fox. As always, we appreciate immigration attorney Susham Modi for joining us here today. Thanks so much, Susham.
Thanks for having me.